Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm excited to welcome Radhika Nayar. Radhika is an associate director of Dhasra, an Indian nonprofit organization whose name means enlightened giving in Sanskrit. She has launched Dhasra's US presence in 2014, and in this role, she builds partnerships, raises funds for the Indian social sector, and disseminates knowledge about social innovation and philanthropy in India. So thank you, Radhika, for joining our speaker series, and I'm excited to hear your talk.
Thank you, Hathal, for that introduction. I'm so honored and humbled to have been included in this impressive lineup of speakers as part of the speaker series. I am in my career is definitely a work in progress, just like all of us are. Thank you to everyone who has taken the time to listen, and I hope that my story in some way can help you create a career and life that is true to the unique and extraordinary person that you are. Today, I am stepping outside of my comfort zone, which is what I would like to encourage all of you to do in small and big ways. So I'm walking the talk. I will be speaking for about 40 minutes, which is the longest time I've spoken for without interruption in a while. And I have notes to support me here. And I'll also be speaking exclusively about my story, which I haven't ever done before. So thank you for this opportunity. I will be focusing specifically on how I've applied my passions, my personality, and strengths to build a career in philanthropy, where, among other things, I raise funds to improve the lives of disadvantaged girls in India by keeping girls in high school, delaying their age at marriage, pregnancy, and building their self-esteem to make life choices. I will take you through my childhood and critical life transitions and lessons, and then wrap up with some key takeaways. So to begin, I'll start with my growing up story. My story began with my parents, who immigrated to the US in the 1970s from Delhi, India. My dad came here first in the mid-1970s, and my mom joined him when they got married in 1979. The picture on the left is of them in Central Park in 1982 with my oldest brother, Raghav. We lived in Kew Gardens in Queens until I was 4 years old and then moved to Westchester County. I don't remember life in Queens, although my mom tells me that we had a lively social life and were surrounded by many Indian families in Queens and Long Island who had similarly recently immigrated to the US. We also lived near the airports, the Kennedy Airport, and had frequent visitors from India. The second and third pictures here are of me when we moved to Westchester. I am playing dress up in both instances, as you can see. Before I went to New Rochelle Public Schools in Westchester, I went to the Immaculate Heart of Mary School for kindergarten. The middle picture is from Halloween at IHM. And I don't know about any of your Halloween experiences growing up, but my parents didn't really get Halloween and weren't really into the spirit, and made me dress up as an Indian princess every year. And kindergarten was no different. In retrospect, I think being an Indian princess was a lot cooler than being a cat or Barbie. But at the time, it was, oh, I'm an Indian princess again this year. And here you can see me as an Indian American girl next to the Statue of Liberty. Next is my high school years. So I'd like to fast forward to high school. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, which is a suburb about 40 minutes from New York City. I went to the public elementary, middle school, and high school. I thrived, I would say, more academically than socially. Although I had fun at the time, I didn't have as much fun as I would have later in college, and struggled sometimes with feeling that I didn't belong and people didn't understand me, which I think is typical of many adolescents and high schoolers' experience. New Rochelle High School is one of the most racially diverse high schools in the country, with some 60 countries represented in its student body. But there were very few Indian Americans, and my experience was that there was division according to racial and socioeconomic background, and I didn't fully experience that diversity. There were about 3,000 students in the school. Most of my friends were Jewish. At graduation, I distinctly remember one of my friend's parents confused me with the Iranian American salutatorian, and that may give you a sense of how I felt sometimes invisible or not fully seen. I was a good student and I enjoyed school very much, and I was really privileged and lucky to have excellent teachers who believed in me and gave me the gift of loving to learn. There were a few formative experiences at that time that I'd like to mention. One of my favorite classes was global history with Mr. Schultz, my sophomore year. For an assignment, we had to conduct oral history interviews with members of our family who had experienced war. My classmates interviewed relatives who had experienced the Vietnam War and World War II. And I, at Mr. Schultz's encouragement, interviewed my grandparents who had experienced the partition of India, which was the division of British India into two countries, Pakistan and India, in 1947, when India gained its independence from Great Britain after 300 years of colonial rule. I interviewed my paternal grandmother, who was 16 at the time of partition. And after partition, Pakistan became a country for Muslims and India became a country largely for Hindus. And if you weren't of the dominant religion, you had to migrate to the other country. So 15 million people were uprooted and 1 to 2 million people died. This picture is of my maternal grandparents outside of the Taj Mahal, which is a monument of love, after India became independent. In his comments on that assignment, Mr. Schultz wrote that my grandmother and I should write a book together, and that the partition experience could be the subject of my first book. That statement from nearly 2 decades ago has stuck with me and helped me get through trying times and reminded me about my abilities. Secondly, I also traveled to Turkey my sophomore year as part of a program called the Experiment in International Living. I wanted to go to Turkey because I was a history nerd and I wanted to see the beautiful monuments and art that I had read about in my history textbooks. This is a picture of one of those monuments, the Hagia Sophia, which was a Greek Orthodox church and later became a mosque and is now a museum. I traveled with a group of 10 high school students from across the US and spent 6 weeks in Turkey. We each lived with a family in Istanbul and then another family in Inegöl, which is a town 4 hours from Istanbul. And we did volunteer work in a village. It was an eye-opening experience. And I learned a few things that I'd like to note. One is that the world is a small place and people can speak a different language, have a different culture, but everyone really wants the same things out of life. And we have more in common than we think. It also made me grateful for living in the US. The families I stayed with were eager for their children to learn English, which is the language of the world, and I took my ability to speak in English for granted before that point. I also felt grateful that I grew up in the US as a woman. My host sisters were my age and could not move around as freely in Istanbul or other cities. They would get harassed by men on the streets, and their families would obviously worry about them. And I didn't have that same challenge to navigate growing up where I did and could move around as freely as my brother. So in addition to my teachers, my family members were my role models, as you can see here. The first picture is multi-generational, my mom, grandmother, and me. The middle picture is my mom and her twin sister. The next picture is my brother and I in high school. I couldn't include my dad here, would have been too crowded, but he taught me a lot about his work ethic as he built a business while I was growing up. My mom and my aunt, my mom's twin sister, who I call Masi in Hindi, were the most influential people in my childhood who shaped my values and also my career and purpose. They are fraternal twins. They're both educators. They went to great schools in India, but had to go back to school in the US because that education wasn't recognized. My Masi was a single mom and came to the US after my mother. My mother supported my aunt and vice versa. They were both married at the age of 20, even though neither of them necessarily wanted to get married at that time, but that was just how things were done. And still what many Indian girls and girls around the world have to do at a certain age. And marriage for them, as it does for many girls around the world, meant sacrificing their education and individual dreams and goals. For my mom, that meant following my dad to New York, which is not ideally where she wanted to be. She loved India. She didn't want to leave her family. For my aunt, that meant dropping out of medical school in India and then having to reinvent a career for herself in the US. I realized at a young age that my life was going to be different than theirs. I knew that I was privileged. I knew that I would be the first woman in my family with the capacity to decide when, whom to marry, and how much education I wanted to pursue, and the type of career that I wanted to build. And maybe some of you who are listening are also in that position. So I would say, don't waste that opportunity. I wrote my college essay about my relationship with my mom and aunt and how they shaped me. And my high school English teacher, Miss Sackelman, was quite moved, which gave me a lot of confidence during that stressful, sometimes stressful, frequently stressful college application process. So given my feminist awakening at a young age, and thanks to my family, it's no surprise that I decided to go to a women's college whose most famous alum is Hillary Rodham Clinton, former Secretary of State, Senator, and most recently 2016 presidential candidate. This is a picture of her giving the 2017 Wellesley commencement address. She graduated from Wellesley in 1969. So Wellesley is known for, and its mission is to provide an excellent liberal arts education for women who will make a difference in the world. Throughout campus, there are banners, I don't know if they're still there, but of women who will, entitled Women Who Will, highlighting women who have made advances in various fields. I think in college, we all knew that we wanted to or had an obligation to become leaders in the world, thanks to the education we were receiving. At the time that I went to college, which was 2002, Wellesley was particularly known for alumni who had succeeded as top executives in the business world and broken glass ceilings. The most popular major was economics, and our career services were strong for the financial sector. So many of my peers pursued investment banking in 2006 before the financial recession of 2008. I'm sure things have changed since then and diversified. My dad was happy about Wellesley's connection to business and wanted me to pursue that path. The other picture is from the movie Mona Lisa Smile that you may have seen, and which was filmed on campus the first semester of my first year. So while Wellesley has a strong history of women's rights, it also was traditionally known in the 1950s setting for this film as a school for girls who would then go on to marry successful men and not pursue their own ambitions. I and my friend Monica, who is Filipina, tried out to be extras on the film, just like everyone else on campus. And we were obviously not chosen because we did not look like Wellesley looked in the 1950s. And now I'm proud to share that Wellesley has its first African-American president in Paula Johnson, and a lot has changed since the 1950s. Wellesley was also about the same size as my high school or smaller, with about 2,000 students. I really thrived academically. I loved school. I continued to explore my identity and interests. My favorite classes were in history, women's studies, classics, and psychology. I majored in psychology. I minored in women's studies. And I really took whatever I wanted to in addition to the core curriculum. I remember there were 15 students in one of my classes the first year of college. And I really loved the individualized attention and getting to know my professors. I graduated with honors and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. Socially, some of my closest friends were Asian American or international students, as you can tell by these pictures. I didn't look into diversity demographics when I was applying to school, but realize now in retrospect that I benefited greatly from and gravitated towards having so many friends from other countries and who were also first generation Americans like myself, in contrast to my high school experience. So, as you consider where you'd like to go to college, diversity may be worth looking into. While I was in school, I had a few work internship experiences that provided me with feedback about what I liked, didn't like, and wanted to do more of. In school and in internships, I would encourage you to pay attention to what fuels you, what makes you come alive, your passions, anti-passions, and these experiences will help you make choices that align with who you are going forward. I was a writing tutor at the Learning and Teaching Center. My first year writing professor, Professor Colazzi, taught me a process for writing and revision that has been critical to my success in college and the workplace. He didn't allow us to use the verb to be in our papers, so we couldn't write is, are, or am, and had to use more active language and verbs. And we had to present 3 drafts for every paper we wrote, so had to show a process of revision. And he would always say that writing happens in the later stages, not in the first draft. He nominated me to be a writing tutor, which I was for 3 years. I loved the experience of teaching one-on-one, listening to fellow students, and strengthening my writing ability through teaching others. In parallel with taking classes in women's studies, I also volunteered at the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence that provides comprehensive support services for Asian American families experiencing domestic violence in the Boston area. I used to volunteer in the residence for women. I found where I would talk to the women and just be a sounding board for what they were going through. I found direct services to be challenging. I often got too close to the women and children and their stories and couldn't maintain professional detachment. And so I ended up recreating that role a bit and balancing direct services volunteering with working on communications and marketing in the office. I received a fellowship at Wellesley Centers for Women, which is a women and gender research and action center. I did research on South Asian immigrants' experience of marital violence, their help-seeking behavior, and the competence of services available. So whether these services are culturally sensitive and helpful to South Asian families and women. Through that experience, I learned that I love to write and research and present, but I didn't like spending so much time by myself in the library, and I needed to interact with people more often during the day or work week. I also wanted more practical, real world rather than academic experience as in the next stage of my life. And that's exactly what I got, which is practical real life experience. And when I first graduated from college, I was more motivated by extrinsic rather than intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation means what it may sound like. It means motivation coming from outside of yourself. External rewards, conformity, societal pressure. Intrinsic motivation means you draw motivation internally from the process, enjoyment, interest, and passion. You do it anyway, even if no one rewarded you. So I took an entry-level job as a legal administrative assistant in the international legal group at AllianceBernstein, which is an investment management and research firm. It wasn't what I wanted to do, but I earned good money and had health insurance, and my family was happy. In 2008, I got laid off in the recession along with most members of my team. Then I worked at WJB Capital, which is a smaller firm in financial services. I worked on corporate access. My job was sales and marketing. I would cold call institutional investors. I would create corporate access events where we brought together senior level management of publicly traded companies with potential investors. I got laid off there as well during the crisis, and that company ended up shutting down a few years later due to financial difficulties, so it no longer exists. At the same time, I also took the GRE and LSAT. Like many of my peers who struggled with the transition from college to entry-level jobs, I wanted to escape back to school, but I realized during the process of studying that I didn't know what I wanted, and I made the decision not to take on the financial cost of grad school until I was clearer. At the same time I was doing these day jobs, I continued to pursue my passion for free. And that's when you know that's a calling and you should make that your career. The most important extracurricular activity I did was volunteer for Sakhi for South Asian Women, which is a nonprofit organization that exists to end violence against women. I was the co-chair of the Young Professionals Fundraising Committee. I did public speaking at various events, organized fundraising events with other members of the community, presented to the board. That experience led me to take courses at NYU School of Continuing and Professional Studies. I took courses in fundraising and social entrepreneurship. I wondered if I could translate this growing passion for fundraising into a practical career, and found that I could, and also meet financial goals. I met people who were older than me and making career transitions into fundraising in the social sector, and that validated for me that I was on the right path. I also did a program called Starting Block. It was a 3-day fellowship experience with fellow change makers of my age. It was we had inspirational talks, there was networking, and that experience really opened my eyes to people who were pursuing social impact careers, from working in the private sector, nonprofit, and government, or even art world. So it really opened my eyes to people creatively navigating their careers. And through Sakhi, I met my dear friend Kavita, who left New York to work for this excellent organization in India called Dasra, and who I credit with opening that Dasra door for me and literally changing my life. I am glad that I experienced working at AB and WJB. I learned invaluable career and life lessons that have carried me forward and made me better and wiser. I'd like to share a few of those. Major life lesson, I learned not to silence myself, my inner voice, and follow what interests me. If I could talk to my 22-year-old self again, I would say you don't have to be someone else to be important. You can be yourself, and relax, everything will work out. In terms of career lessons, transitioning from being a student, where I was evaluated on my intellectual abilities, to doing administrative tasks in the workforce was challenging for me. I learned that no task is beneath you, and you have to build trust by successfully completing small tasks in order to gain more responsibility, and that you can also exercise leadership in any role and convert that mundane role into, or mundane tasks into, a platform to lead. And secondly, I learned that sometimes you don't have mentors and role models, you have the opposite. Anti-role models and anti-mentors, and you can learn a lot from people you don't want to emulate. I would encourage you to just always gather information. I won't go into too much detail here, but my experiences in these jobs, through those experiences, I applied what I learned by not having the best supervisors and not being treated well, to being a good supervisor at Dasra. And also in my role at Dasra, I respect and treat admin assistants well. And in turn, these assistants to major donors treat me well and have helped me in my fundraising role to gain meetings with donors and partners. So after a series of professional setbacks or clarifying experiences, I moved to Delhi, India, where my grandparents live. This is a picture of my grandmother on the left and I hanging out in the sun. The middle picture is my friend Tushar and I attending a friend's wedding. Dasra is located in Mumbai, which is another city in India. I wanted to find a Dasra equivalent in Delhi, but couldn't. There was lots of family resistance to me moving to Mumbai as a single woman, and where we didn't have a lot of social networks and support. And I had to overcome and confront that to make my dreams come true. I'm someone who writes to clarify my thoughts and come up with a game plan. I relied on this tool called 40 Days Forward to gather my thoughts and get clear about next steps. I learned about this exercise through Starting Block. I heard Tara, the author, give a talk about her life and the choices she made. and to create a life aligned with her values. And in India, I did this 40 Days Forward journey, which is basically a series of exercise and prompts daily to help you reflect on your strengths, perceptions, what fuels you, what drains you, obstacles, limitations, assumptions that may stand in the way of living the life of your dreams. And this is an exercise that I believe you can do at any age, at any point in your life, to gain greater self-awareness and clarity about what would be the next best step for you. And through this exercise, I became more aware of myself, my limitations in my thinking, my needs and goals. And I accepted that even though my family didn't support me at that point, I really needed to move forward to the next phase of my life and muster up the courage to move to Mumbai and work at Dasra. So to fast forward to Dasra, which is where I work now, I work at Dasra, and I've been working here for a little over 7 years, 2 years in India and Mumbai, and 5 years in the US. Dasra means enlightened giving in Sanskrit. We are a nonprofit organization that does not provide direct services to communities, but rather builds bridges and connections between donors and community-based organizations. Dasra educates and enables both donors and community-based organizations to have greater impact and improve the lives of people living in poverty. In India, there are 3.3 million nonprofits versus 2 million in the US. And India has the largest number of people living in poverty of all nations in the world. It also has the 4th largest number of billionaires out of all countries in the world. So it is a complicated place. Community-based organizations and nonprofits do not have the systems in place and funding to grow and best serve their communities. Donors often view the social sector in India with skepticism and don't believe that giving to nonprofits will make a difference. Dasra fixes all of these problems through a 3C model depicted here that I won't go into right now. But in addition to this model of creating knowledge, facilitating collaborations and funding and capacity building, we realized that in order to make progress on India's many development challenges, we had to focus on women and girls, and specifically adolescent girls aged 10 to 19, who the government, nonprofits, and donors did not focus on enough. We have built a platform to raise awareness and funding for adolescent girl-focused nonprofits. This picture is from one of those organizations that Dasra has helped reach more people. And Saiba is the girl looking at the camera. These girls live in some communities in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh in India. Their parents are poor. Some of these girls do not go to school because school is far away. They have a lot of chores to do and manage the household in their mother's absence if their mothers are working or have passed away. Their parents sometimes don't see value in educating girls, and they don't see education as a path to employment. This picture was taken at a session where these girls were learning about their health, menstrual hygiene and nutrition, and also their rights, that they are legally not supposed to get married until 18. And they discussed other issues of concern in their lives. So when I do my work in the US, which is to really fundraise for these programs, I do it for Saiba and other girls who, in an ideal world, would deserve the same opportunities that we have all enjoyed. But I work practically to make sure that their lives are at least incrementally better than their mothers. Now, in addition to working in a different cultural environment when I lived in India, we had to do a lot of team building activities that I wasn't comfortable with. This is a picture from a team retreat. I had to face my fear of heights and climb a tree or a pole. When I reached the top, I yelled that I needed to be brought down in front of all of my colleagues. that could have been an embarrassing moment, but in contrast to my previous work environments, I had felt comfortable enough to speak my truth, that I was afraid and I really needed to come down. And my colleagues didn't judge me for my fear and helped me get down. I am grateful that I now have a tribe of friends who share my personal and professional values and who I look up to. They are always trying new things and stretching beyond their comfort zone. And that's an unintended consequence of pursuing your passions. You end up meeting great, awesome, like-minded people. So here I wanted to talk a little bit about my day-to-day work just to make it concrete. I don't have a typical work day, but and when you work for a nonprofit startup or startup organization in the for-profit sector where you typically have lean teams, you wear multiple hats and do a lot more than what you may expect given an initial job description. And I actually love that. This slide doesn't capture the full extent of what I do, but it's a start. My priorities in the US are to raise funds to India with a focus on girls, share knowledge and best practices about giving to India, and also build Dasra US as an institution. So recruit board members, make sure that we're legally, financially compliant, our communications is on track and doing well, so that we have, we're currently working on developing a website for Dasra US. I typically start the day with phone calls with the India team at 8 a.m., which is about 6:30 p.m. India time, and to follow up on what's happening internally. I have 5 to 10 meetings a week with donors, partners, prospects. I spend most of my time preparing and on follow-up. I do a lot of relationship management. So each interaction with the donor or partner is an opportunity to build trust, credibility, and rapport. So I have to be very careful and thoughtful in all of my interactions. I also organize events, build community through gatherings, and these are in donors' homes. I invite people, create invitations, create programs with the donors, speak at these gatherings, and follow up with attendees. And annually, I have led the Dasra Philanthropy Forum, which is our flagship conference. And you can find out more about the forum at that website, dasraphilanthropyforum.org, where we have, there's video recordings. And then lastly, I also, along with the India team, organize learning experiences for U.S. donors interested in giving to India, and often accompany these donors, which you can see in the last picture. This is a picture from a trip with a Philadelphia-based Women's Giving Circle that supports programs in India. And these visits to India include community nonprofit site visits, as well as conversations and talks with experts on India's development. And these are resources that I consult and revisit to continue to grow and learn on my path that may be helpful to you. I won't go into this now, but maybe we can revisit at the end if we have time. This slide is about the 40 days forward exercise that I did. This is a particular wheelhouse exercise that was useful for me when I had to objectively assess what next for myself, and maybe useful for you to build self-awareness and also to make decisions. You'll see here, after I did this exercise, I realized that the limitations were so small in comparison to everything else and so minor that I really had to move forward based on all of these other factors: strengths, my passions, purpose, specifically that aligned with moving to Bombay and working for Dasra. In addition to these resources and taking the time to read, I would encourage you to take the time for self-care and keeping your mind, body, and spirit positive. And I do that through fitness, visioning on Pinterest, and spending time with mentors and women I admire through the Asian Women's Giving Circle. I think, sometimes as first generation or children of immigrants, we often focus so much on doing that we don't know how to necessarily incorporate balance in our lives. But in order to grow, you need to take care of yourself. So I would encourage you to look into some of these practices and what works for you. To summarize, I want to leave you with a few key points. The first is self-awareness is critical to building a successful career aligned with your passions. So pay attention to how you feel, what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, and what you are drawn to repeatedly and obsessively. And once you identify what makes you come alive, you have to make a real commitment. There's no magic formula to success. You need to work hard, make good choices, be determined. You also need to figure out the how. How can I best apply this passion in the world? For me, I knew I was passionate about so many different things, which is great. And I'm sure many of you listening to this webinar are also passionate about so many things. I'm passionate about women's rights. I'm passionate about psychology, curious about people and their motivations. I care about community building. And that presented a lot of options. I could be a researcher, a teacher, a marketer, storyteller. My role in philanthropy allows me to do a little bit of all of these things, which is why I love it. So I love the variety. And here I would say, there's no finish line in achieving your goals. It's something I've learned only recently. You don't wake up one day and say, oh, I'm done. Life is a series of stepping out of your comfort zone moments, adjusting, getting used to that, and then stepping out again to achieve new and bigger goals. And that's really the only way to move forward. I would say that you could start small. You could read a book on a subject that you don't know a lot about, visit a neighborhood you don't know about, then do public speaking, lead a club at your school. You get the gist. I didn't get into this much on the presentation, but quickly wanted to mention that on your path to achieving your goals and crossing things off your to-do list, take the time to take care of yourself. Fitness, visioning, and hanging out with people I admire are my restorative practices, which I had mentioned earlier. I'd encourage you to identify what are your restorative practices, what nourishes you and refills your well. And lastly and finally, if you don't take anything else from this presentation, I hope that you take away the knowledge and confidence that you can build a career that adds richness to your life, gives you a vehicle to contribute your unique talents to the world and make your mark, plus pay the bills. You'll find a way. And don't settle until you find that role for yourself. And that role may evolve as you evolve. In closing, we need you to be your best self and offer your gifts and leadership to the world. Thank you in advance.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think the details are here. So if you want to connect with Radhika, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask a few questions. Okay. So you talked about here, the 40 days forward. Do you think that this is something, do you want to maybe talk about the process a bit more? Maybe it's something that anyone who's watching this can do right now to then kind of understand really whether you can go directly from high school to college and then a career that you're passionate about, because I know that so many people again want to typically pursue the status quo because it's what's expected, it's more stable. But is this an exercise that anyone can really apply, and do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely think it is an exercise that anyone can apply. It's a series of daily exercise. I think the time commitment is like 10 minutes a day, and it just prompts you to reflect. So when I started doing the exercise, I think the first a few exercises were, questions, what do I see around me? And then it graduated into what are the limitations that I think, what are the things that are holding me back? And so I would write this down in a diary, and I saw that, wow, what's holding me back is lack of confidence in my abilities. Um, I'm not good enough. There's going to be so much family resistance. And when you see it on a piece of paper, it sort of minimizes it. You can objectively assess you can objectively assess the situation. Whereas when you're in your head, it becomes it's chaotic. And then I saw, and then I also saw, what refills your well, what nourishes you. Those are questions that are asked also. And then I thought, wow, I love community building. I love reading and writing. I have to give back to the world. These are all the things that I wanted to do, that I needed to do. And then I saw that this was all aligned with moving forward to Dasra, and it helped me solidify for myself that that's what I needed to do, and that I could handle whatever family resistance may come my way, because I knew at that point, because I knew that I would gain so many things, and that eventually my family would come on board, that they would see that I was happy. And so it just provides you with that, just a framework and a process to organize your thoughts, and also unpack some of these limiting views you may have about yourself or your life. I remember I through preparing for this presentation, I looked through my diary and I saw that I thought to myself, oh, other people can pursue their dreams, but I can't. I wrote that down as one of my limitations. So I think it's just so powerful to do this.
Yeah, that I mean, it's incredible because so many people just set themselves up to think that they can't do, instead of trying to identify what's possible and what they can do. So that's why I like this exercise of really trying to understand what may be possible and how you can pursue it. And then I know that there's I think it's called Critical Conversations, a book called Critical Conversations that helps you have conversations that then that may be tough but need to happen so that you can grow. So you had some critical conversations with your family. Do you want to talk a little bit about how those went? And of course, your family, from the pictures, they're still supportive. So they must have been hard conversations, but what were they like, and how did you persevere in having those?
Yes, I would say that it was, a staged. I couldn't just leave New York and then move to Dasra in Mumbai. I had to have this. I had to do things in a process. I had to influence my family through a step-by-step process, that this was fine. I was going to be fine. And so I think I prepared them along the way. And so I think those are things. You also have to think about strategies, right? This is, my parents maybe, and make compromises. When I moved to Bombay, I lived in a neighborhood that my parents were comfortable with, even though it was an hour from work. I, um, you make those adjustments. I think my parents, at the time when I moved to India, it was also during the financial recession in New York. So because the world in some ways was ending or reinventing itself, I think they were more open, because all of these things, dramatic things had happened in my life too, of just like not moving forward in a career, that they realized that maybe she's right in the back of their minds. Maybe she needs to pursue a more creative path. So I was aided by a lot of external factors, but I also moved them along slowly. And I would say that my grandmothers were also champions of me staying in India. So you have to think about all of the influencers in your life, right? And so they loved having me there. So they would prefer that I was in Bombay and I could visit them monthly, right? So they're my parents. They have more authority. So I also included them persuade in the process of persuasion. And then also my friends at Dasra, when my parents met them, they realized, okay, she's working with a great group of people, and maybe she has to make this investment in living and working in India, then she'll come back to the US, which is what my path was anyway, and what I wanted to do in the first place.
So perhaps if someone were to take the 40 days forward, practice or use the tool, they could identify the forces around them to then kind of move that process forward.
Absolutely.
Right? In the wheelhouse, perhaps? Or is that part of the wheelhouse challenge? Or how would you see them doing that?
Absolutely. So I think when you do the wheelhouse, you can put up your limitations and really, be practical. Okay, what are your limitations? I think there's this one slide over. Yeah, it could be financial limitations. It could be anything, right? And so then you can come up with a practical solution. So what I'm saying is, as you pursue your passions, you also have to think about practical. You can't miss thinking about the practical, right? So this really helps in bringing it all together, and you realize what you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I found this like in the beginning of the 40 days forward exercise. This is what you write down as your commitment. So this may provide more clarity about this whole journey. So I wrote in my book in 2011, I, Radhika Nayar, commit to embarking on the 40 days forward journey by taking the time to reflect on the present, assess my strengths, envision the future, consider letting go of habits that hold me back, and look for ways to experience greater abundance, generosity, courage, and confidence.
I wish that everybody pretty much wrote that statement down, that's really a life that's fully lived.
Yes, right? A life that's fully lived. And I think I didn't realize until before 2011 that I could also live that life. I could also pursue my dreams. Why do other people get to be happy and I don't? And I think, but it's interesting because there are moments in your life where you also then go back and don't feel as great. And so I have to remind myself about this process, about how to build a life that's authentic. So it's something that actually I'm considering revisiting this and doing this again, because I'm sure my things have changed since 2011.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great tool. I think anyone can really apply to kind of understand what they might be hesitant about. So again, it's not easy, as you've also experienced, it's not easy to graduate from college and not pursue the stable pathway. Of course, that's the kind of, in America especially, we have student loans, and so we have to focus on paying those down. And if you're living in a city, a bigger city that might be more expensive, that's also a focus area. But through doing this, maybe taking or using this tool, you might still be able to find ways to support yourself so that all of that is possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Are there any other, amongst your resources here, are there any other resources that stand out particularly that perhaps someone who's really considering right before they make that step, which of these resources might best serve them?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I think as I was reflecting on this resource list, I think the talks and interviews are really powerful. And so I would recommend going through all of these talks and interviews. I think there's a few TED Talks here, Teach Girls Bravery, Not Perfection, by Reshma Sajani, who is someone I admire. Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. I would also recommend this book called The Four Agreements, which is a very famous book that basically is a framework for living your best life. and it offers and in four and it lists out four agreements for living your best life. The first is to be impeccable with your word. So stay true to the commitments you make uh, for your life. Don't speak ill of other people. The second is to not take anything personally, which is a huge agreement. The third is to never make assumptions. These are all simple but extremely profound, and he explains these agreements. And the fourth is to always do your best, meaning put those agreements into practice. And so that's a great framework for living your best life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all of those is very, very powerful. And I think I've seen both of the TED Talks as well on grit and about bravery, not perfection. So I think it's good to have this conversation. It is November. We have, this is around the time that students might be thinking about what colleges, or they're focused on college applications. And if you, just through the perspective or lens of what colleges are looking for these days, we know that they want well-rounded individuals who are presenting themselves as more than just academics, right? So they do have to have or present themselves as passionate people with interests, varied interests, but also focused interests. So what would you say in helping some of the students who up until now really thought that academics was sufficient? How would you say that they can promote themselves for their favorite college like you did for Wellesley?
Mm-hmm. So this is a hard one because I know it's so much harder to get into college now than it was when I went to college. And I really, maybe because, being a child of immigrants or from a different culture in India, I think students really focus exclusively on academics. And so that's what I did growing up. I did focus largely on academics, but I would say that, I wish I had volunteered more and done what I ended up doing in college more in high school. And I had that interest. I did volunteer, I think, for National Organization for Women, but that, I was in high school. My parents didn't really encourage that. But I would say that, you learn a lot by volunteering, by being in leadership roles in student clubs. And I think had I had those experiences earlier, my transition into the work world, and not only college applications, it makes you more attractive, but my transition into the work world would have been smoother. Because it prepares you for work as well as for college.
Right. I think that's really important to understand. Is you're right that it's tougher to get into college these days than even, 5 years ago. It is a lot more challenging, but it's not challenging to really, and it's kind of what this slide is about. It's not challenging to really find who you are. And I think that's also what colleges are looking for these days is at a younger age, they want you to really have had done some sort of journey to then find what your passions are, what your interests are, so you can bring that best self to your peers in that college environment and really add to the diversity. And I kind of wanted to go back to the diversity piece because, that was really, really critical. I mean, you're living the international woman life right now. You lived internationally. And so this piece here in college where you had friends who are also from international contexts added or enriched your life greatly. Do you want to speak about really the kinds of people that enriched your life?
Yes, and it's interesting. I think in response to your previous question, I don't think I gave myself enough credit for my high school experience because I did go to Turkey, and I did, and that was not conventional. My friends were going to Italy and to France, but I wanted to go to the East. Turkey is in between the East and the West, and I wanted to experience a totally different culture that other people around me didn't know a lot about. And I think that showed my interest in, demonstrated my interest in history and just in my curiosity about the world. So I think maybe that helped me also in applying to college. So I would say just pursue what you're interested in too, and what's authentic to you. In college, my friends ended up being a lot of them international, first generation immigrants, and we could just talk. I didn't have to explain. I think I could just, there was a comfort level and an understanding that I didn't have with friends in high school. And that has enriched my life. I consider all of these people to be my sisters, and we have stayed connected and share career challenges, share life challenges, and just help each other navigate the next phases of our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's something. So each of these individuals, they have such a unique perspective, and they have they represent diversity even in this picture, as you can see. But then when it comes together, you do have that unified bond of all really being either first generation American or having that shared collective experience of being first gen or having immigrated or having those experiences that are similar. So when looking at pursuing your passion, I think it's important to remember that when you're pursuing your passion, you're enriching your life, and then you're also enriching the lives of others around you. As you mentioned, by finding people who are like-minded individuals, and you can just see how happy you are in these pictures, right? So I think that's just beautiful. So do you have any closing comments other than I can go to your last slide? Do you have any closing comments for our young, any audience actually?
I would say feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and thank you so much for listening and letting me share my story.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful story. Everybody has a beautiful story, and I think it's thank you for sharing it with us. It's always great so that everyone else can see how your journey, it wasn't linear, and it typically never is linear, but that's okay too. So next speaker series in December, it's going to be December 15th, which is just under a month away, is with Minda Hartz. So we're excited to have Minda join and talk about, she has a podcast, and she does a lot to really bring women of color to the table and provides them a platform to raise their voices. So it's going to be a fantastic speaker series, and we're excited about hosting Minda in December, and hope everybody can join us. And thank you, Radhika, as well, for sharing your story again with us today.
Thank you.